Stephen C. Smith, welcome to Turner Classic Movies.
Thank you, Eddie.
You are here because you have a new book called Hitchcock and Herman, The Friendship and Film Scores That Changed Cinema. I would venture to say that most cinephiles of my age, Bernard Herrmann is the first film score composer that they really recognized because Alfred Hitchcock is the first filmmaker that they recognize. To start us off, when did Hitchcock and Herrmann become a team?
Well, they became a team incredibly rapidly. They had known each other since Hitchcock's earliest days in Hollywood. And it's remarkable to think that although we think of Bernard Herrmann as the composer of Alfred Hitchcock movies, his first movie when he was 29 years old was Citizen Kane. He had been brought to Hollywood by his New York radio friend Orson Welles, and then would just visit Hollywood about once a year from his home in New York, where he loved to conduct the CBS Symphony. He wrote these great radio scores. He liked to do it all. But he loved scoring film once he discovered how fun it could be doing it with Welles. And he and Hitchcock met as early as 1942. I saw a letter that Benny wrote his then-wife, Lucille Fletcher, saying, saw Hitch at the Brown Derby, says we have to get together and work together sometime. So they had a friendly relationship for about a decade, but Hitchcock, surprisingly, had relatively little say in the music of his movies until he became his own producer. And in the early 1950s, when Hitchcock got this incredible deal at Paramount to basically make whatever he wanted and get a great deal of money in doing so, he could choose his own composer, and he chose, for The Trouble with Harry, Bernard Herrmann. And I have to say, it's fascinating that these two men were so drawn to each other because superficially, they were so different. So on the one hand, you have Hitchcock, who seems very calm, and there is Benny, who is sort of like a brilliant human volcano. And yet somehow these men forged an 11-year friendship and collaboration. And it's because inwardly, I really believe they shared the same soul. They both loved beauty. They were both romantics. And they both shared a vision of life that encompassed tragedy and a lot of anxiety. When they worked together on The Trouble with Harry, it was this instant connection of, I have found the other person that I want to just keep working with.
And it's unusual that The Trouble with Harry is their first collaboration, which is not the typical Hitchcock film in any way. But the film that we're going to start with tonight is the ultimate in terms of their collaborative work. So we're going to start hot with arguably Alfred Hitchcock's most famous movie, Psycho. Explain how Herrmann's music became such an integral part of this movie.
Absolutely. Well, this movie really began as an experiment for Alfred Hitchcock. By the mid to late 1950s, one thing he had definitely noticed that while he was spending $4.2 million on North by Northwest, which was a huge amount of money at that time, people like Roger Corman were spending a few $1,000s and grossing enormous amounts of money, millions of dollars. So he decided in 1959, what if I gave myself a tiny budget, used the crew of my TV show, and made the edgiest, sexiest, darkest, most censor-baiting movie I can possibly think of, violent, and he found the ideal material in this little-known novel by Robert Bloch called Psycho that people were not very familiar with at the time. The experiment pretty much worked during the shooting, he thought, when he showed it to his young screenwriter, Joseph Stefano. And Stefano was stunned at what he saw, and not in a good way. As he later said, I came out sick. I thought it had no tension. I thought it was a truly terrible film. And Hitchcock said, oh, don't worry, dear boy, don't worry. It's just the rough cut. Well, evidently, Hitchcock walked out of that room and sometime not long thereafter walked into a room with Bernard Herrmann and said, in effect, I hate this movie. It has no tension. It didn't work. And according to two sources, Benny said, you don't realize what you have. Finish the movie. Keep shooting, because they were not quite done. I have some ideas. Well, Herrmann certainly had ideas, and one of the remarkable things about him wasn't just his ability to put a viewer inside the minds of the characters so that we feel the anxiety of Marion Crane, and we feel the terror and the horror of characters and the sense of dread, but he also could pace an entire film in his head. And he had a brilliant notion for the color of the music. And by that I mean the instruments he would choose. Because for Herrmann, as important as the notes he chose were the instruments he chose. He decided to use an enormous all strings orchestra, 50 players, nothing else, no woodwinds, no percussion or anything, because he said he wanted to complement the black and white photography with a black and white sound. And it was an intuitive idea, but I think it's ingenious because black and white isn't just black and white. It's got all these infinite shades of gray. And that's what Herman did by limiting himself to all the different stringed instruments. He came up with every kind of color, every sound, most famously in the murder music.
Right.
And not only was the sound of Psycho part of its tremendous success and impact and the intensity of the music, but it was also a real personal triumph for Herman because the only thing Hitchcock said was, do whatever you want, except do not write any music for the murder scenes. Well, characteristically, when Benny felt differently, he acted differently. And he wrote music for the murder scenes. And when they mixed all the sounds, the way Hitchcock originally wanted it, without music, he was frustrated because it did not have the intensity that he wanted. And Herman said, well, Hitch, I did write music for this scene. May we
Boy,
play
he
it
must
my
have
way?
been eager to pull that out of his
Oh,
pocket.
he was just waiting. And Hitchcock said, of course, we'll play it that way. So they played what is now, I would say, the most imitated piece of film music ever written.
Well, Stephen, that was magnificent. You set this all up without giving away too much.
I tried.
Yes. So for those folks who have not seen it, they are in for a treat. Because here it is, whether you have seen it 100 times or you're seeing it for the first time right now, here is Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann's Psycho. Stephen, I've probably seen that film more than any other movie in my life. And it is always effective, always spectacular. But I want to hear from you about the reaction that the public had when this was unleashed on them.
Well, Hitchcock got a very good indication of what the reaction was going to be even before a single member of the general public saw this movie, because there is almost always a cast and crew screening. And these are not screenings like a typical moviegoer would go to. These are the people who made the movie. So the actors watching the movie and thinking, oh my God, they cut out that scene. That was my best scene. Oh, they used that take of mine. The crew member is thinking, God, it was hot that day. And, all of that. They're not watching it as a movie. Well, Hitchcock knew that this movie had been utterly transformed by Bernard Herrmann's score. And as you may have noticed, Herrmann has the second to last credit. It's right before Hitchcock's name. So here's the cast and crew screening at Universal. You've got Janet Leigh and her husband, Tony Curtis. You've got the man who is on the verge of completely taking over Universal Studios, Hitch's agent, Lew Wasserman. You've got Robert Bloch, who wrote the book. And they're watching the movie. And as a member of the crew later said, I have never been to a screening like this in my life. The people who made the movie were sitting there, and when the music came in, they just froze in their seats. And then when the murder happened, they jumped 6 inches into the air, as if they were watching a film they weren't involved in. And this crew member said, I had to see what Mr. Hitchcock's face was like. And he said, I looked over, and in the dim light reflected from the screen, he leaned over, looked at me, and smiled. And that was the smile of a man who was about to make millions and millions of dollars from a movie that at that point he owned 60% of, that he made with almost no money. And imagine if Hitchcock had cut that film down and put it on television. I think the entire history of movies of the 60s would have been different because of the doors that this film opened. So I think, taking nothing away from the genius of Hitchcock's direction, the screenplay, his casting, but without Bernard Herrmann's score, I often say it's like a recipe for something that's delicious to eat, but if you're missing that ingredient, it just doesn't work. And without the music of Psycho, it wouldn't be Psycho.
Absolutely. And it's so incredibly influential. And the fact that this score, as much as the film itself, I think, this score influenced a later generation of filmmakers, right? Because Brian De Palma got Herrmann to score his films, and Scorsese famously had him score Taxi Driver. It was like they said, wow, we can actually have this part of film history on our movies.
Exactly. Right. And in fact, Brian De Palma's first real hit, the movie Sisters, they needed more money to finish the film. And the film's editor, Paul Hirsch, who went on to win an Oscar for Star Wars, Paul had a great idea. Bernard Herrmann had put out an album with about 10 minutes of music from Psycho, and Paul temp-tracked the goriest murder scene in Sisters with the shower music, and they got the money to finish the film. And then they said, well, let's get Bernard Herrmann to score it. And when Hirsch suggested that, Brian De Palma said, he's dead, isn't he? I can't remember the last movie he worked on because Benny had been out of Hollywood for a while, but that's another story.
We have plenty more ahead. So don't go away, because we are coming back with this spectacular night of Alfred Hitchcock movies, all of them scored by the great Bernard Herrmann. Coming up next, The Man Who Knew Too Much.
Next on TCM, The Man Who Knew Too Much, then Vertigo, and later North by Northwest. Alfred hitches a ride with Herrmann tonight.